Whenever you talk about politics, of course, you end up dated before long, unless you have an audience that, like myself, is very interested in politics and traces it back through the centuries. But here in Australia, we have just had a series of very dramatic and enlightening presentations on the time when a Prime Minister who won by one of the greatest margins at a most unexpected time, Kevin Rudd, was toppled by his primary assistant, the Deputy Prime Minister. And the whole thing got very, very nasty. And it was very revealing to watch this series of 3 programs called The Killing Season. And it just reminded me again of what I said in the previous 2 sessions on the subject of conflict between leaders, that the conflicts we often see in the church are part of the human condition. But it's a shock to us when it happens in the church, because we make such claims about love and about the love of God and about following Jesus. And so when we have conflicts, often they become quite nasty, and they sometimes leave a scar, I've found, on people's lives that are even worse than what happens in a divorce. I think that though divorces can be ugly and horrible, we kind of see so many divorces and we kind of expect it. But when there's a split in a church or a religious organisation, or when there's really hostile interaction between leaders from differing religious circles, we find ourselves, I think, more scarred and alarmed. Well, I want in this 3rd session to underscore what I know I mentioned before, but I want to give more examples of the fact that even the best of leaders can be in conflict with each other. And I suppose the first example of this for me, ironically enough, is Jesus and his conflict with his own mother. Because in the Christian church, of course, Mary, depending whether you're Orthodox or whether you're Protestant or whether you're Catholic, at various levels she's regarded very highly as an outstanding female leader in the history and values of the Christian church. But you might remember that when Jesus was a young lad, and he was not even into his teen years, there was a time when the whole family were on a journey together, and being an extended family a bit bigger than our nuclear families today, somehow or other in all of their activities, the little bloke got lost and to the rest of them, and they had to go back and find him, and they found him amazingly sitting with older scholars and quite confounding them with his wisdom as a young lad. And of course, when eventually he was reunited with the family, his mother was quite cross and asked how he could behave in such a way that would bring such stress to the family. So in one sense, conflict begins between Jesus, the emerging brilliant mind that he was, and his mother, who was such a sacred figure in the history of the church. And of course, if you're going to follow Jesus, you're bound to end up in some conflicts ideologically, because Jesus himself said that sadly it would be the case that parents will be turned against their own children, and that brothers would be in conflict with their own brothers if they were to follow the ways that he was to present. The cost of following Jesus is that sometimes it's inevitable that we have conflict with each other and with others as we seek to interpret what he had to say. I will say this, however, that having said that, in one of the later sessions, I want to look at the way in which Jesus dealt with conflict between himself and his own disciples, and conflict between his disciples. But let me say, to start off with, that Jesus' disciples, as the emerging apostles of the future church planters and church minders in that first century of the Christian church, were also marked by conflict. And I'm not going to read all the Bible passages, it would take us too long, and I'll hope you do your own digging regarding this. But you might remember at one stage even family members got involved, and a couple of mums were having a debate as to which of their sons would sit on the right hand and which would sit on the left, which had kind of special status and role inside of Eastern culture at that time. And so there was conflict even between the mothers, working out which son would be the top dog, so to speak. In the midst of that, we find conflict between the disciples themselves. And one of those major conflicts is between Peter and John, two very great disciples. And both of them, I believe, great writers in the epistles, the letters in the New Testament that shape our values in the Christian church. And I will read this one to you. After the resurrection, after walking with Jesus for 3 odd years in which he showed not weakness, I mean, there were times when he rebuked his disciples. He actually rebuked Peter so strongly once he said, "Get behind me, Satan." So it wasn't that Jesus was just a sloppy, nice, gentle bloke that never challenged anybody. But nevertheless, he set an example of washing his own disciples' feet. And the very Peter he challenged at one stage objected that it was inappropriate for him to wash Jesus' feet as the greater one. And of course, even John the Baptist, his cousin, didn't want to baptize Jesus first off because he saw Jesus as the special Lamb of God, the special chosen one. But as we follow through that story, the Peter who Jesus at one point says has confessed something that is the very foundation of the church, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," has to rebuke him after he actually rebukes Jesus when he says, "I'm going to die." And he says, "You're not going to die as far as I'm concerned, Lord." And at that point, Jesus had to rebuke him. But as we follow on with the story, we find that Peter and John, as part of an inner circle, a small group of the 12, not the whole group, that went on a couple of very significant occasions, such as the journey to the mountain we call the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus suddenly sort of shone before them with a kind of supernatural glory that blew them all away. Peter and John were the kind of disciples that went in those special situations. But after all of that, after having Jesus wash their feet, after being taught by Jesus, "Blessed are the meek, and blessed are the peacemakers," we find that even after his death and example of saying, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing," to the very people that were nailing him on the cross, these two guys are in conflict after the resurrection. And in John 21, we read this. Peter saw, as he turned, that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. Now there in itself is a little problem, because John writes the story and he doesn't name himself distantly, but he says the disciple whom Jesus loved. There apparently was something of a special affection between Jesus and John. And of course, in any leadership group, the person that's close to the leader, close to the boss, is always likely to be under some kind of shadow and in conflict with people who aspire to be up the pecking order of leadership in the group. It's a sad part of human nature. But anyway, it says, this was the one who leaned back against Jesus at the Last Supper and who said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" And when Peter, after the resurrection, after he's been restored to status again after having forsaken Jesus in his greatest time of need, in the hour when he denied him in front of a servant girl around a fireplace where he was warming his hands. After all of that, now Peter shows a dark side in his character. And he sees John and he says, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answers, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that got to do with you? You must follow me. And because of this, the rumour spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? So here there is this jealousy. What's going to happen with him, Lord? And Jesus has to say to him, get your eye off conflict in the group. Get your eye off your tension with other leaders. And ask yourself what you're here for. What is your mission? Work together. What happens to him is up to God, not up to you. But get on with what you're called to do. What's that got to do with you? Follow me. And then let me say that later on, St. Paul, the one who in many ways probably held the church together in the first century against all sort of external and internal attacks, we find that Paul has conflict with Peter also. I don't know whether this means that Peter was particularly given to conflict. Maybe that would be unfair to say. But certainly, this is a strong conflict between two great apostles. Remember, Jesus had said to Peter, when he confessed him to be the Christ, that upon this rock will I build my church. And of course, Protestants and Catholics debate about this. But either way, that means Peter was very, very significant in the founding of the Christian church. But Paul conflicts with him so badly that in Galatians, writing a letter to an open church, and as we understand it these days, a letter that would have gone to other churches as well. So this is a public statement about a stoush between two of the most important leaders in the church. Now you imagine what that would have caused in terms of angst for those that like Peter most, and for those that like Paul most. That was not avoided by Paul, and this is what he says. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. I mean, that's pretty strong language, because he was clearly in the wrong. Now, leaders can be wrong, and leaders can differ because they differ with one another about what is right and what is wrong. And he said, before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, the outsiders. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the group that were circumcised, the Jewish group of Jesus' followers. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Now that's intriguing, because Paul and Barnabas had a huge missionary history together, and they went around everywhere, actually anointing people to become elders of all the new churches that were being formed. Here's someone that's another person that we're going to find later on has a conflict with St. Paul, and yet these were two men at the very foundation of the planting of the church. He says about that, even Barnabas was led astray. So he critiques two of the outstanding apostolic figures, Paul does. And then he says, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, you're a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? So here is a conflict between leaders, three outstanding leaders, that's over a cultural issue. But in this case, Paul goes further, if you want to read the book of Galatians through, and he actually accuses Peter of being theologically wrong, accuses him of being a hypocrite in the way he lives, because he says one thing and lives another, accuses him of cowardice because a bunch of these heavies from Jerusalem had come and stood over him, and he'd given up what before he stated was the truth, that the gospel was as much for the Gentiles and they weren't expected to become Jews to follow Jesus. Now, I finished this session to just say, here are some amazing conflicts between outstanding leaders, Jesus and his own disciples, John and Peter as outstanding disciples, and Paul the great apostle in conflict with Peter and some of the others who followed Peter when he went off the track. And later on, we'll look at some of the issues. I've named one issue, and one issue is the issue of culture. Often there is conflict over issues of culture, and we'll add to that many other issues that undermine leadership and that cause good men and women to be quite testy with each other. And in this case, it's so strong, Paul says in a cute way in the old language, I withstood him to his face. Here is strong conflict between good leaders who go on to serve the Lord and go on to actually be champions of the growth of the Christian church. Despite that, somehow they worked through their conflicts and got their eye on the real issue. As we used to say, you can't drive a bus by the rear vision mirror, and you can't win a tennis match by watching the scoreboard. You've got to get your eyes on the calling and go back to those words of Jesus to St. Peter. What's that got to do with you, Peter? Quit your fighting, quit your conflict, and just follow me. And we'll look at what that means in a future session.